Greetings. Thank you for joining us at the U.S. launch of the 2022 Lancet Countdown. My name is Renee Salas, and I'm the senior author of the 2022 U.S. Brief and an author on the Global Report, with a variety of affiliations, including affiliated faculty at the Harvard Global Health Institute, the host institution of the U.S. Brief Working Group. These reports that we're going to discuss today are meant to be tools, living documents for all of us to further our collective work. Thus, we have an amazing lineup of speakers that will provide background and context on the release for the United States, including its recommendations and the policies and actions that are needed. This is timed to occur right before COP27, so the stakes of inaction and health benefits of climate action are at the forefront of the discussions. I'm a practicing emergency medicine doctor, so serving my patients during a crisis is what I'm trained to do. It's the oath I took. But the burning of fossil fuels has created a health crisis that I can't fix by the time I'm treating my patients in the emergency department. Asthma flares, heart attacks, heat stroke, mental health crises. I can put a Band-Aid on these problems, but then I send my patients back out into a world where fossil fuels are driving dirty air on a hotter planet with accelerating dangerous storms and hazards. Prescribing an asthma inhaler isn't going to fix the cause of an asthma attack for a young boy living next to a highway where cars are producing dangerous pollutants and climate change is driving increases in wildfire smoke, pollen, and ozone pollution. Health providers across the world are trying to manage the health harms of fossil fuels, making our jobs harder or even impossible, especially as crises collide in every corner of the globe. But when I'm treating a patient, if something I'm doing to help them isn't working, I don't keep doing the same thing. I do something different. And the same has to be true for the climate shocks we're experiencing: hurricanes, heat waves, droughts, flooding, and more. We must move away from continuing to burn fossil fuels in a fair and just way to clean, healthy options like solar and wind. The good news is that this isn't a rare cancer that we don't have a treatment for. We know the treatment we need. We just need the willpower from all of us and our leaders to make it happen. And that leads us to today, where I hope you will see three important messages throughout the discussion. First, the health voice is only growing louder. This release makes the diagnosis crystal clear. We must emergently invest in a move away from fossil fuels that is fair and just and prioritize health, putting the most vulnerable people and communities first. Just like in my emergency department, we treat those who are sickest first, and we need to make sure the same thing happens in our response to climate change. As a doctor, I have a responsibility to my patients to sound the alarm that we can no longer prioritize the profits of fossil fuels over our health and well-being. Second, action is happening, especially the recent passage of the most historic climate legislation in U.S. history, the Inflation Reduction Act. We have an opportunity and responsibility to make sure the health benefits are maximized as this and other legislation unfolds. Third, we can only solve this crisis by working together, and this collaboration serves as an example. The U.S. Brief is a collective effort of over 80 U.S. organizations interconnected to the global Lancet Countdown network, which reaches every continent with 99 authors from 51 institutions. They are what inspire me to keep doing this work and give me the confidence to know that we can and we will catalyze the climate action we need together. I now have the honor and privilege of introducing our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Jalon White-Newsome. She is the Senior Director for Environmental Justice at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, working to leverage the force of the full federal government to support communities across the country that have been overburdened by pollution and subjected to decades of environmental injustice. Thank you for joining us. Dr. White-Newsome, over to you.
Greetings, everyone. I am honored and excited to celebrate the virtual launch of the Lancet Countdown, Tracking Progress on Health and Climate Change 2022 Global Report and U.S. Brief. Congratulations to the many organizations, all 80 of you, professional societies, researchers, health leaders that, again, work globally and domestically to make this report a reality. I started working as a researcher and advocate at the intersection of climate change, health, and environmental justice over 15 years ago. And I've seen how climate change has uprooted, disrupted, and in some cases, shortened the lives of so many people. I've witnessed my family, my friends, and neighbors suffer from multiple heat waves, severe flooding. I've tended to loved ones' physical and mental health and overall well-being, which has been jeopardized by repeated pollution exposure and the trauma of experiencing climate tragedies over and over again. But I know my family and friends are not alone. As the 2022 Lancet report confirms, climate change continues to be an injustice amplifier for communities across the U.S. This report, along with the wrath of hurricanes, heat waves, fires, and flooding that dominate the headlines, underscore the unfortunate reality that folks are continually exposed to more pollution and not offered the best solutions. That your health status is dictated by your zip code and the amount on your paycheck. That investments in resources often miss the communities they need to target. And that community voices and expertise, which are foundational to decision-making, are often silenced and shut out. But I'm here to say that this reality and our climate is shifting. And I'm not just talking about the physical climate, but the climate of government, the climate of leadership, and the climate of opportunity. I am deeply honored and privileged to serve as the Senior Director for Environmental Justice at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. And because President Biden and Vice President Harris have advanced the most ambitious climate and environmental justice agenda ever seen in the history of this country. Having spent much of my life as an environmental justice advocate, I know that policy can never be perfect, but this administration has made some great progress because of people like you. So one of those areas of progress, as noted in the report, is the Inflation Reduction Act, which represents, again, the single largest investment and I think the most impactful, potentially the most impactful legislation for climate and clean energy solutions in U.S. history. It will position America to achieve Biden's climate goals, cut down energy costs, create good jobs, increase energy security. And moreover, the law will reduce greenhouse gases by about a gigaton, cut pollution in half by 2030, and get us to net zero by 2050. And for communities with environmental justice concerns, this reduction in source pollution, coupled with increases in clean transportation, energy efficiency, and green space, will help build the resilience in communities that have long suffered from environmental racism. It's great to see that the findings and recommendations that are part of this report align strongly with much of the goals of the Biden-Harris agenda. For us to be successful, these historic investments must be cultured or coupled with a culture shift across society as well as across our federal government. And part of this culture shift is the Justice 40 initiative, which is, again, the administration's commitment to ensuring that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments actually make it to disadvantaged and marginalized communities. The task for reorienting federal programs so that their benefits reach these communities is unprecedented. And the Justice 40 initiative has the potential to deliver tangible, real, on-the-ground benefits to communities. And so we are working every day to make sure that Justice 40 and the IRA, again, really are historic. And I firmly believe with intentional investments and a clear path forward, with environmental justice at the forefront, we can create a healthier and more equitable United States. I want to challenge each of you to use this report to do your part in advancing environmental justice, which for me has always been a fight for health. I want to encourage you not to just add this report to your physical or virtual bookshelf or your resume, but consider taking some action. And so here are a couple ideas to get you started. So first, I encourage you to think about identifying an environmental injustice in your community and advance one of the many recommendations in this report. Secondly, Find a community-based environmental justice or social justice organization that you could support with your time, talents, and energy. Build a partnership. Work together to advance climate, health, and equity. And last but not least, spread the news to a friend or family member. Education is power, and the more connections we can make beyond the usual climate suspects, the better. So again, this is just a start, but I am sure you will continue to do great things in whatever role you play. I am truly honored to play a small part in the release of this and look forward to continued partnership as we collectively work to advance health, equity, and environmental justice across this great nation. Thanks, Renee.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Georges Benjamin. I want to thank Dr. White Newsom for that and those important remarks. I'm at the American Public Health Association, and the American Public Health Association is extraordinarily committed to addressing the issues around climate change and health, and are, of course, strong supporters of the Lancet Countdown U.S. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marina B. Romero, who's the Executive Director of the Lancet Countdown Tracking Progress on Health and Climate Change. Marina will be sharing key highlights from the 2022 Global Report.
Hi, Georges, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. And it is my absolute honor to be joining the U.S. launch of the 2022 report of the Lancet Countdown and of the U.S. policy brief, which is enormously important to us. The Lancet Countdown 2022 report was launched yesterday, and I'm going to share with you some of the key findings of this report. If someone can just confirm that you're seeing my full screen, please.
Yes, we see it. Thank you.
Perfect. This represents the 7th in the series of the Lancet Countdown reports. We've been publishing annual iterations of 44 indicators for 7 years in the hopes that the evidence we produce can help guide policies and actions to protect the health of people around the world from the emerging health threats of the climate crisis. And obviously, this type of policy briefs that the US partners have produced with the American Public Health Association are a key founding stone of our policy engagement work. With this report, we've pulled together about 99 authors from 51 institutions globally. As you can see in the screen, we have leading academic and UN institutions that contribute tirelessly to producing the evidence that I will present to you today very briefly. You can find out more visiting the Lancet, and you can find what this means for the US in the policy briefs that you're going to see today. The main finding that we see in this report is that we're seeing a persistent fossil fuel addiction, which is not only affecting our health through the health harms of the climate crisis, but also affecting our health directly through other harms of fossil fuels. We're seeing that around the world, people are getting exposed to dangerous levels of heat. Obviously, this affects mostly those vulnerable communities, the elderly, those living with underlying health conditions, those that cannot take care or protect themselves. About 4 billion extra days of heatwave exposure occurred in the latest years with respect to a baseline that just started a couple of decades ago. We're also seeing with great concern that climate change is increasingly undermining food security globally. And that comes at a point in which food security is also being threatened by the war in Ukraine, by the emerging energy and cost of living crisis. And we're seeing through this example how climate change is acting to exacerbate other compounding crises that we're facing, eroding the foundations that our health and well-being depend on. We're seeing infectious diseases becoming more and more suitable, and their spread to latitudes where we didn't see them before. Health systems having to cope with emerging diseases and the risk of epidemics and pandemics ever again. But we're not only seeing the effects of climate change on our health, we're also seeing that the fossil fuel addiction is leading to direct health harms. People around the world still lack access to clean fuels in their homes, and they're using dirty energies, including biomass, due to the lack of adoption of clean renewable energies. What this means for their health is that people across 62 countries that we've analyzed are exposed to about 30 times the levels of PM 2.5 air pollution recommended by the WHO. This will have permanent effects on their respiratory health, their cardiovascular health, their development, their well-being. We're also seeing that the addiction to fossil fuels have less families vulnerable to the rising energy prices, grappling to meet the basic energy needs, and very prone to ever more indoor air pollution as they cannot afford clean fuels. At this point in time, with the rising energy prices, this is an acute risk for health of people everywhere. This also includes the US or the UK, the country where I'm not at now. But one thing that is particularly worrying is that we're seeing that despite the health harms of climate change that we're seeing, and we have been recording throughout 7 years of Lancet Countdown reports, countries around the world and companies around the world are still taking decisions that actively jeopardize the health and well-being of people around the world. We're seeing governments all around the world in high and in low-income countries still providing subsidies to fossil fuels. We analyzed 86 countries. 80% of them were still actively subsidizing fossil fuels to net amounts of $400 billion in 2019 alone. This is while countries have still failed to deliver the 100 billion committed in the 2009 Copenhagen Accord to support a just transition. And at the same time, we're seeing that oil and gas giants are taking strategies and activities today that mean that in 2040, their emissions will more than double level compatibles with a healthy future. If they continue down this path, they will condemn us all to a future of increased ill health and impacts of climate change. However, we're also seeing that with the climate crisis and the energy crisis, with the rising energy costs, these oil and gas giants have made record profits this past year. By redirecting those profits to promoting low carbon or zero carbon energy generation, they now have it in their hands to promote a just low carbon transition. But we see with concern that many countries, in response to the energy crisis, are going back to increasing the production and the burning of fossil fuels, including coal, which harms our health enormously through air pollution. So we're seeing the world now at a critical juncture again. As countries devise their responses to the energy crisis, to the cost of living crisis, backsliding to fossil fuels could lock us into a catastrophically warmer future. It would shift us away permanently from meeting the Paris Agreement goals and condemn billions around the world to a future of ill health. However, at this point in time, in responding to the converging crisis, we can take an aligned response to the energy, cost of living, and climate crisis, which is centered around health. By rapidly shifting away from fossil fuels, we could not only avoid catastrophic health impacts of climate change, but we can also avoid 1.2 million deaths annually per year because of the burning of fossil fuels. We could also avoid up to 11.5 million deaths from high carbon, unhealthy diets if we were to shift to more plant-based, healthier, and less polluting diets. We would also deliver more resilient energy systems. We could reduce energy poverty by delivering to people's homes the clean energy that they need. We could deliver greener cities with more active transport, where people have benefits to their physical health and to their mental health. However, at this point in time, we need to commit globally to a health-centered response. And as we head down to COP, we need to demand that our policymakers take bold decisions to ensure that we not only deliver a future where we can survive the climate crisis, but also a future where people around the world can thrive through better health, better climates, and better lifestyles. And with this, I just want to thank you very much for your attention and invite you to visit the lancetcountdown.org, where you can see our report in further detail, explore our findings, and also download the policy brief for the US. And thank you so much to the American Public Health Association, to all the authors of this 2022 US policy brief, and all the best for this event. I hope you get inspired and take action. Thank you.
I now have the honor to introduce Dr. Natasha DeJohnette, who's been a leader in environmental health research for over 10 years. Her positions in academia, as well as her national environmental and public health associations, including being a former staff member here at the American Public Health Association, have worked very hard to advance research agendas for the environmental health workforce. She's been very much engaged in the debate around national climate change and health initiatives and inspired the next generation of environmental health professionals. In addition, she is an environmental health champion serving 4 national nonprofit boards. In addition, I want to introduce Naomi Baylor, who is the director of the Climate Change and Global Health Initiative at the University of California, San Francisco's Institute for Global Health Sciences. She has worked for the past decade to lead impactful research and advocacy initiatives to advance public health equity in the US and internationally. Ladies.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Dr. Benjamin. I am Dr. Natasha DeJohnette, co-lead author for the 2022 brief and assistant professor at University of Louisville. So I will offer comments on the state of climate change and health in the United States. As a young child, I noticed that I couldn't breathe as well when I visited my grandparents' neighborhood. And through a graduate research project, I discovered that this was because my grandparents lived in an area of environmental injustice with poor air quality that was due to the presence of steel mills, toxic sites, interstates, and an airport located within their communities, along with historic discriminatory housing policies. And there are health outcomes like cardiovascular disease, low birth weight, and many other chronic conditions that we may face today because of that. We all deserve clean air to breathe, but here in the US, climate change is harming our health and well-being. And in this year's Lancet Countdown U.S. policy brief, we focus on how air pollution, heat waves, infectious diseases, and mental health are hurting people in this country now. And though we are all at risk to the health impacts of climate change, there are certain populations within our community that bear a heavier burden, exacerbating some of the disparities these groups already face and acting as a threat multiplier for them. I'll briefly step through each of these key health impacts that are discussed in this year's brief, starting with air quality. So the burning of fossil fuels is driving climate change and decreasing the quality of the air that we breathe. Cities that have higher air pollution levels also have higher death rates. In fact, poor air quality is linked with adverse impacts to every major organ system in the body. In 2020, 32,000 deaths in the US were due to exposure to ambient human-caused particulate matter pollution, 37% of which were directly related to fossil fuels. Air pollution and the health problems it causes are not evenly distributed in our communities. Children, older adults, and pregnant people are particularly susceptible. Communities of low wealth and communities of color are more likely to be located on the areas of fence lines of hazardous air polluters like highways, polluting industries, and toxic waste sites. Also not evenly distributed are adaptation features that can protect health, like green infrastructure, including tree cover. At University of Louisville, we have established the Green Heart Project, a controlled trial study where trees are the intervention. And we've planted over 8,000 trees and are assessing air quality and cardiovascular health benefits that result from greening our community. The 2022 brief also discusses heat. Heat is the top cause of natural weather-related death here in the US. And this is a great concern because we have an extended and hotter warm season, along with heat waves that are longer, more frequent, and more intense. In fact, heat-related deaths for people over age 65 are estimated to have increased by approximately 74% in recent years. Extreme heat can also change cognition for children increased risk of poor birth outcomes for pregnant people, and increase the threat of kidney disease and death for people that work in outdoor settings. Therefore, policies that can reduce heat exposure can benefit health and equity. Changing gears to infectious diseases. We're seeing increasing infectious diseases connected to climate change. Climate change is creating environments here in the U.S. that are more conducive to disease transmission, including Vibrio through water and Lyme and West Nile through ticks and insects. For example, due to our longer, hotter, warm season, we're seeing a 48% increase in the amount of time mosquitoes need to spread dengue, and its contagiousness has increased by 64%. Lastly, the 2022 report shines a spotlight on mental health. This is a vitally important health outcome, but it's harder to measure. And as such, there's not currently a U.S. indicator on mental health. However, there is strong evidence that climate change is associated with more depression, stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, and anxiety. So we felt it needed to be included in this year's brief and highlight that groups with close ties to the land, like rural and indigenous communities, have a higher mental health burden of climate change's impacts. We need action now for communities like that of my grandparents to ensure the health and safety of all. And there's great hope in the health benefits of improving air quality. While we know that cities with higher air pollution have higher death, we also know that even small decreases in air pollution are associated with significantly longer life expectancy here in the US. Therefore, health and equity-centric goals must be prioritized in policies to ensure a healthier and more equitable future for all. And I will now hand off to my colleague and fellow co-lead author, Naomi Baylor.
Thank you. When I hear the statistics just laid out for us about how climate change is impacting health here and now, I'll be honest that personally and professionally, it can feel overwhelming. I've spent my career in public health working with impacted communities, and I'm a mom to 3 young kids. I don't want my kids or the communities I work with to live in a world where these climate indicators continue to get worse. These impacts aren't an accident. They are the direct result of policy decisions that prioritize the fossil fuel industry at the expense of our health. But today, I want to talk about reasons for hope. Because the good news is we can use deliberate policy action to slow climate change and improve health. This is the 5th Lancet Countdown U.S. policy brief, but it's the first to come on the heels of meaningful climate legislation in the U.S. The Inflation Reduction Act is an important step forward. It will invest nearly $370 billion in clean energy and climate solutions. It's estimated that it will reduce emissions 40% by 2030, and we have to do more. Not all climate solutions are equal. Some have great potential to improve health, while others can deepen existing health and environmental inequities. We have an incredible opportunity right now to make sure new climate investments prioritize solutions that improve health, especially in communities most harmed by climate change. So let me share 4 recommendations for what we can do today to put health at the center of our climate response. First, we need to end our dependency on fossil fuel, which is already harming health around the United States. We can achieve this by rapidly moving to zero carbon electricity and transportation systems that run on clean energy like wind and solar, which are healthy and affordable. And we must target our efforts to improve air quality in our most impacted communities. Second, we need to stop subsidizing and end the development of new fossil fuel infrastructure. There's no feasible path to achieve our climate goals that includes the development of new fossil fuel sources. But in the US, we spend at least $20 billion each year subsidizing fossil fuel companies. And this is money that could be used to accelerate the clean energy transition that will protect the health of everyone. And this gets us upstream to turn off our addiction to fossil fuels. Third, we need to invest in climate solutions that make our communities healthier, more equitable, and resilient to the impacts of climate change we're already experiencing today and those that are unfortunately already locked in. This means expanding parks, trees, and green spaces that protect against extreme heat and provide space for kids to play outside. It means having functional and affordable public transportation systems and safe bike lanes and sidewalks so that everyone can get where they need to go without polluting the air we breathe. It means reliable and affordable clean energy for all. Finally, protecting our health from climate change requires that all countries act together. The U.S. is the largest contributor to historic emissions and is the second largest contributor to climate pollution today. But the U.S. also has an opportunity now to be a leader in a rapid and just transition toward a resilient future by investing in proven climate and health solutions here at home and in the countries most harmed by climate change. If we put these recommendations into practice, we don't have to wait to see the health benefits. We will experience immediate health gains today through cleaner air and healthier cities while preventing the worst impacts of climate change. A few minutes ago, we heard an update on a series of indicators that are designed to track our progress on climate change and health. We will only see these indicators move in the right direction if we advocate together for real policy change and make sure the brief's recommendations aren't just more words on a page. With the will to act on these recommendations, we can end our fossil fuel dependence and create a fair, healthy future. I started off by saying I'm hopeful, and I am. The recommendations I just shared were developed collaboratively by experts from over 80 of the country's leading institutions working on climate change and health. This group represents just one small part of a growing movement. The path envisioned by the U.S. Brief Working Group is not only possible, it can be inevitable if we as health professionals work together with frontline communities, youth, and the many others that have long led the call for climate justice to make this a reality. It is my honor to work alongside so many of you to make it happen. Thank you. And with that, it is a privilege to introduce the moderator for our next session, Nada Hasnain from USA Today, who will lead a panel discussion that will dive into just that. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Naomi, and thank you all for tuning in today. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the discussion today. We have Dr. Kyle Hill, who is an assistant professor of Indigenous Health at the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of North Dakota. We also have Lily Gelb, who is a student leader with Schools for Climate Action, as well as Dr. Pamela Pugh over at the Chisholm Legacy Project, where she is the Chief Programs Officer. And we also have lawyer Irene Berga, who is the Climate Justice and Clean Air Program Director at Green Latinos. Thank you all for joining us today. And I'd like to go ahead and let our panelists introduce themselves and share a little about the work that they do. So let's go ahead and start with Lily. I'll hand off the mic to you.
Hi, my name is Lily. I'm a junior in high school and I'm turning 16 years old next week. Today, I'm representing Schools for Climate Action, a youth-led climate advocacy organization working to center the voices of students and teachers in climate policy. First, I want to say that I'm so thankful to the Lancet Countdown for including a student perspective on this panel, because we know that youth will be the most impacted by the climate policies put in place today. For instance, the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act will greatly influence the future that I will experience. While more work needs to be done, seeing this historic investment into climate solutions brings me hope. In Sonoma County, where I live, students have suffered repeated climate-related wildfires while also struggling through the pandemic for the past few years. We watched as continued roadblocks prevented Congress from acting on climate change. This impacted our physical health through the extreme air pollution from the smoke, as well as our mental and emotional health from both the disasters themselves and the fear for our future, given the lack of a response from political leaders. In response, we marched, we wrote letters, we organized, and we joined together across state lines to call on Congress to address the climate crisis. Schools for Climate Action is based in Santa Rosa, California, 1 hour outside of San Francisco. We were founded 5 years ago by a volunteer group of teachers and students. Our first project was helping to mentor students across the country to pass climate action resolutions in their school districts. We now have over 85 school board resolutions across the country. Additionally, in the past 5 years, Schools for Climate Action students have written and passed a climate emergency declaration in California and also authored 2 federal House resolutions, HRES 29, supporting the teaching of climate change in schools, and HRES 975, expressing the mental health impacts of recurrent climate-related disasters on youth. At the end of last month, 5 members of our group traveled to Washington, D.C. to lobby for HRES 975, which was written by 2 students in our group. While we were there, we organized meetings with 70 congressional offices, attended advocacy meetings with the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, trained 60 8th graders in advocacy, hosted an 80-person lobby day with the 8th grade class, and spoke at a press conference about HRES 975 along 4 congressional members. While we were in DC, we recognized that many congressional offices had not made the connection between mental health and climate change, and we are proud that HRES 975 is the first piece of congressional legislation that links the 2 issues. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lily, for sharing. Dr. Hill.
Yeah, hi, good morning or afternoon, wherever you're at. My name's Kyle Hill. I'm enrolled in the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe in North Dakota, and lineal descendant to the Siston, Wapton, Oyate, and Cheyenne River Sioux tribes, both in South Dakota. As they said before, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Health at the School of Medicine at the University of North Dakota. And in that program, I do research primarily on the intersection of health equity and climate change and planetary health with Indigenous communities. But also I teach social and ecological determinants of Indigenous health policy and public health programming. So excited to be here with everyone, and I just want to appreciate the centering of environmental and climate justice in the Lancet policy brief. And right now, one of the biggest issues I see for Indigenous communities is the considering, when we talk about the land back movement, we want to center and facilitate discussion and certainly like a reparative framework around developing some way for us to revitalize our Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges, but also recognize that that's rooted within our traditional territories and homelands. And so we understand right now that Indigenous communities protect about 80% of the world's biodiversity, yet only make up about 5% of the world's population, and we might only, occupy or be on about 20% of the world's surface. And so, as important as that is, to protect biodiversity, we lean heavily on our Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges, and that's really just a way of saying, like, our life way. This is a way of living. These are our cultures, these are our traditions, these are our spirituality, and it happens to be place-based, collective, and holistic in nature. And so then when we also recognize a more recent investigation that noted the results of that were that we've lost about 99% of coextensive historic homelands and territories, and displaced by as much as 200 to 300 kilometers on average, our tribal and our Indigenous communities have in North America. And in particular, I want to say that report was for American Indian Alaskan Natives. But we have to ask ourselves then, like, how do we respond to the calls for climate justice? What does that mean? You know, the justice aspect of that. And I think, you know, some of the pieces of the climate policy, the Lancet report addressed that quite well. At the same time, I think there is certainly a need to be able to identify not only the risk factors and the vulnerabilities of Indigenous communities and other communities of color, but also the ways that the Inflation Reduction Act stands to alleviate those vulnerabilities and also appropriately resource Indigenous communities in particular to be able to revitalize and reclaim and you know, utilize those Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges again. So I just, again, want to say thank you. Appreciate this opportunity to share space with everybody. And, you know, we're in this together. So appreciate it, and wonderful comments so far. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hill. Dr. Pugh.
Good afternoon, morning, or evening, wherever you are. Yes, there have been great comments so far by Lily and Dr. Hill. I am Pamela Pugh, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Programs Officers for the Chisholm Legacy Project. And I probably almost pick up from where Lily left off. And when I was thinking about coming here, I was thinking about the NAEP scores that were released yesterday. Those are scores that are often referred to as the nation's report card and allow states to look at how they're doing from year to year on test scores. And so, though, you know, many of us were not surprised that disruption in education due to COVID-19 or the high rates of illness and death, and even children being orphaned at an unprecedented rate would impact those academic scores across schools in our nation. I think what is most intriguing to me is that we still look at these factors separately and singularly, without thinking about the environmental and the climate injustices, as well as the environmental injustices that many of these children are exposed to. I think about the city of Detroit, which unfortunately receives national news. And again, we're talking about academic performance, but we also have to think about the fact that these are post COVID-19 numbers compared to pre-COVID-19. But we also think about the fact that this was an epicenter for COVID-19. This was an epicenter before that for asthma rates for children. And before that, there were those of us screaming about the polluting factors that lead to asthma that then is a leading factor or a leading cause of school absenteeism. So what I really am looking forward to is this report really driving home the point that we, number one, have to prioritize children. And we know we're talking about, most importantly, BIPOC children and children living in low-income communities, those children who are most impacted by environmental injustices and our frontline communities, and making sure that we are doing whatever we can do to improve those conditions in those neighborhoods, and making sure that it's that all that we do is centered around addressing the drivers of climate change. But really, when we're hearing these mainstream media stories, that we're able to put the whole picture together and not leaving these factors out. And so I look forward to the conversation, as well as where this report can help to carry the conversation, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act funding can help to lead these various pieces to come together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pugh. Irene.
Hi, and thanks so much for having me. So for my intro, I was asked to describe why I'm interested in climate, health, and equity. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of my background. My first connection with and to the environment was spending summers as a little girl in the Andes Mountains in Peru, where my father's from. And I'm a proud immigrant hailing from Spain and Peru. And I was raised in occupied Chumash and Tongva territory, today what's known as Los Angeles, where I immigrated to when I was 8 years old, which was another incredibly formative experience. LA is where I was first exposed to serious air pollution, and living in a mostly Latino industrial part of the county with two major freeways, heavy truck traffic, moving cargo to and from the ports, and oil and gas fields nearby. And it wasn't until college that I learned about the term environmental justice and started making the connection between the illnesses many of my friends and families experienced, like asthma, and the location of where we lived and the exposure to sources of pollution. So this background deeply shaped, my career trajectory and my kind of interest in this topic, really kind of by necessity. So now, as the director of climate justice and clean air for Green Latinos, I get to represent my comunidad Latina. We work on climate and clean air issues that directly affect our familias. Green Latinos is an active comunidad of Latino leaders emboldened by the power and wisdom of our culture, united to demand and dismantle racism, resourced to win our environmental conservation and climate justice battles, and driven to secure our political, economic, cultural, and environmental liberation. And we really envision a healthy and equitable society where communities of color are liberated from disproportionate environmental burdens, are free to breathe fresh air, drink pure water, and access clean transportation. And that's why 2 weeks ago, I want to talk about something that we launched. We, along with 22 partners, launched the Latino Climate Justice Framework, or LCJF for short. And this is a new report highlighting the issues disproportionately affecting our Latino community and providing a blueprint for an equitable future. Many of the points in our report are supported by the Lancet brief launched today, and I'm very happy to see kind of additional resources and research that's really needed out there. And the historic movement that we've launched with the Latino Climate Justice Framework is the culmination of a year-long process to co-create with Latinx serving organizations a lasting framework for addressing the climate crisis that prioritizes environmental justice and elevates Latinx priorities. The framework that's presented in this report builds upon the significant work of frontline climate and environmental justice leaders to elevate our unique burdens. So just to give y'all a taste, the report includes everything from air and water pollution in our communities, to climate migration, to language access issues, to farm worker rights, and bringing resources and justice to Puerto Rico. And this framework was developed really to help our partners and families and friends and decision makers to stand together to fight for environmental liberation at this critical time. The Latino community is resilient, but in developing the LCJF, we are recognizing that our communities are suffering and the time to act is now. And I'm very, very excited to see where the points of alignment are between the Lancet brief and the LCJF, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Irene. Looking forward to jumping into our discussion on ensuring health and equity in implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Act. As a reporter covering health and environmental inequities at USA Today, I'd like to first pose some specific questions to each of you on that very topic. So let's go ahead and start with Dr. Hill. Dr. Hill, you were an author of the World Health Organization's policy brief on mental health and climate change. Can you talk about this often overlooked consequence of climate change and what these funds can mean for mental health equity in tribal communities who have experienced repercussions of heavy industry extraction and other climate and environmental injustices?
Yeah, sure. I think, first and foremost, we recognize that there is, intersection of health equity and climate, environmental justice efforts. And so, I think what often gets overlooked is the mental health challenges posed by this. And so within Indigenous communities, a lot of my work is, of course, at the intersection of health equity and climate change. But really, when a little bit more in depth, it's a lot about mental health. Like in my background, I'm trained as a psychologist. So I get my PhD in clinical psychology, went back for my MPH. And so recognizing this kind of disparity, we talk a lot about physical health, but with respect to Indigenous communities, the biggest issue that we grapple with is historical loss, which is essentially colonial subjugation for, from our tribal communities. I had mentioned earlier, the biggest thing that stands out for us is the land dispossession with, again, like near complete land dispossession. Again, I said 99%, and a lot of people had mentioned that, but then the number really didn't come to fruition until a more recent investigation in the past couple of years. And so it really helps us understand just the comprehensive nature of the, colonial project, the architecture of this. And for the most part, with respect to climate justice and environmental justice, we have to recognize that all of our, traditional lifeways organized around our access, number one, and ability to utilize our land, number two. And that's being challenged right now at rates that, are pretty incomprehensible. But I think our generations before me would say that it was worse back then, right? So in American Indians we weren't allowed to practice our religions or spiritualities until 1978 with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. We weren't recognized as citizens until 1924. And so even in our own territories, communities, we weren't recognized as one, belonging, but two, not able to engage these traditional life ways that recently the federal government actually elevated as central to implementing adaptive and mitigation activities across the U.S., certainly globally. And so these knowledge systems are not only place-based, but they're organized around, again, Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies that have served us time immemorial. And so the original stewards of the land, the caretakers, it's important that we're part of this, actively, and obviously partnering with Western science. And sometimes we would call that, a two-eyed seeing approach. But yeah, I definitely think, the Inflation Reduction Act is helpful in a sense, like it provides the Bureau of Indian Affairs with tribal block grants. There's a lot of community-oriented objectives and resources being filtered through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, through tribal communities. And also a lot of Indigenous community members or a lot of American Indian Alaska Natives make their homes in urban communities. Like for myself, I lived in our ancestral homelands of St. Paul and Minneapolis, Minnesota as a Dakota person. And I can say for us, having tax credits for things like, small things, just to make our homes a little bit more resource and energy efficient, whether that's a induction cooktop or whether that's, changing, being able to get energy efficient windows, other appliances, insulation, that's all important. And I think it does leave, though, some big questions too about how as a community do we meet some of these some of the issues that we still have, the risks, the injustices. We know that Manchin had a side deal with the Inflation Reduction Act that was also quite problematic until it was withdrawn at the last minute. And so that provided subsidies again for oil and gas leases, which we recognize as the most harmful of any of the risks of climate. And so I think, and when we look at even going back 2016 in Standing Rock, we've had mining issues of copper up here in the Great Lakes, which is the largest freshwater lakes in the world. And so we see these risks that are near and dear and close to Indigenous communities and our land bases that hold our traditional knowledges. So there's just so much going on right now. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act is huge in its potential. And I hope that we're able to scale up these solutions. And again, as we've mentioned before, help kind of steward this just transition. And I hope that Indigenous communities of course, we're on the front lines, but we also need to be on the front lines of change at the tables to be able to make decisions. So I hope that answers the question. There's just a lot there, but I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill, for your insight.
Mm-hmm.
And Lily, would you mind sharing, what would you like to see, these federal dollars spent on in your community to make it a healthier and more equitable place to live?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I live in Sonoma County, California. In October 2017, my community endured the Tubbs firestorm. Many of my friends and classmates lost their homes and all of their possessions, fleeing their homes in the middle of the night. Those of us who were more lucky were evacuated from our homes for over 2 weeks as our communities were surrounded by flames and unbreathable air. This experience led members of Schools for Climate Action to write HRES 975, the first piece of federal legislation to acknowledge the connection between youth mental health and the climate crisis. We believe that it's important for Congress to address this issue, which students are already aware of and experiencing. Many young people in my community feel symptoms of PTSD during large windstorms because it reminds us of the night the Tubbs fire started. Many kids also have a heightened sense of anxiety when they smell smoke, even barbecue smoke or smoke from the frequent controlled burns in our area. Therefore, alongside providing money for wildfire recovery and resiliency, we would like to see IRA funds used to provide long-term mental health resources to communities on the front lines of the climate crisis, because mental health care is a critical aspect of disaster preparation, disaster response, and climate resiliency.
Lily, thank you. I'd like to go over to Irene next. Irene, when it comes specifically to Latino communities and the specific barriers they face when it comes to climate resilience, can you talk about how this federal money could help these communities and what it could miss?
Yeah, so for generations, Latinx communities have been at the front lines of environmental injustice, disproportionately exposed to toxic pollution from power plants, highways, ports, and other industrial facilities. We know that Latinos are significantly more likely to live in counties with unhealthy levels of particulate matter pollution in the U.S. So 48% of Latinos in the U.S. live in counties that frequently violate ground level ozone standards. Latino and Black neighborhoods have also higher rates of unsafe water, and studies have shown that people of color on the whole are more vulnerable to wildfires. So, and just also another important thing is that Latinos are more likely and more represented to work outdoor construction or agriculture, where death rates from extreme heat exposure are higher for Latinos than for white non-Hispanics. This is a critical piece that I think is also highlighted in the Lancet report. So I think the Inflation Reduction Act provides an extraordinary opportunity to advance long overdue investments in a resilient future that I think have been demanded by communities actually for a very, very long time. But we can only ensure that if we ensure that funding does not further entrench the status quo and further entrench our dependence on fossil fuels. So I'd say that, you know, there's good and bad parts to the IRA in our opinion. The investments of the IRA that do include provisions around clean air, clean transportation, drought response and preparedness, boosting community resiliency and used vehicles, you know, the low income electric vehicle tax credits are great. And these are all critical provisions for Latino communities. I'll also say that the provisions around making health coverage and prescription drugs more affordable are also critical for our communities. Now, the concerns were already highlighted by one of the other speakers previously, but along with the positive, there were significant trade-offs with fossil fuels and handouts given to fossil fuel industry. The IRA has provisions around requiring the Interior Department to make 2 million acres of our public lands and 60 million acres of offshore waters available for oil and gas leasing each year for a decade. We know that we're in a super climate crisis. We know that we have to slash emissions in half by 2030. And, you know, the reports come out year after year, IPCC reports. So we know that we can't lock ourselves into more fossil fuel infrastructure build out over the next decade. It's just not workable. It's contrary to the latest science, and it's contrary to what we're experiencing already on the ground. And so I think that's why it's really important to oppose any sort of provisions like that. And that's something that we take very seriously and that our communities take very seriously. And any sort of side deals that will bring about more permit approvals for fossil fuel build infrastructure. So I'll stop there because of time limitations, but we can discuss more.
Thank you, Irene, for your insight. Much appreciated. Dr. Pugh, drawing on your public health background and your experiences working with the Flint, Michigan mayor to implement a health equity and policy approach during the water crisis, I'd like to ask you, how can local and state leaders keep environmental health equity in mind when implementing these funds?
Yeah, so, these are once in a generation type funding, and we know that these have to get to the communities that we are all here representing. And I think that this has been picked up on by all of my co-panelists. And so just making sure from the federal, starting at how the dollars will come out and make it to these states and local community will be key. Who will have control over those dollars? Because one of the things that we saw in the city of Flint, if not the worst man-made crisis, one of the worst man-made crises, which would have been an $80 per day fix that turned into hundreds of millions of dollars, and still trying to fix that issue because there were people who just didn't feel like the lives in that community were worth that $80 a day. There was state takeover of that city. So first and foremost, making sure that those dollars get to the people who know those communities best. We have to have community-driven solutions. When we were working in the city of Flint, and any dollars that we received, we were trying our best to make sure that the residents most impacted would not only benefit from the health impact, but also from any economic benefit. So making sure that if there's economic opportunity there, those dollars must go to those local communities and the communities that look like those of us who are here represented on that panel. And so again, making sure that the decision makers at the local level and at the state level are getting those dollars directly to those communities most impacted, and making sure that how those dollars are spent are driven by them. So I won't necessarily put forward solutions, but I will say that they need to make sure that it gets to the hands of those and who will make sure that it is driven by those communities. We did so much. You talked about the health in all policies approach. Health equity in all policies approach means that any decision that's made, whether it was once we switched back or once we decided what Flint's long-term water distribution would be, no matter what that cost was, public health had to be first and the people's voice had to be first. That meant undoing disinvestment in that community. So for 14 years, our economic development department was down the street at the Chamber of Commerce, and we moved that back into City Hall. That meant putting a public health advisor in City of Flint, who would then work with Department of Public Works, who would then work with the chief financial officer, who would then, all of those together and more, would be going out to community and making sure that community was determining how those dollars to undo the wrongs of that community were driven by that community. I'll just say one more thing is that we had the opportunity to bring in and put out the largest bid to a minority woman-owned business that was able to get a bid as a contractor when we were doing our pipe replacement. So my thoughts are those solutions be community designed and that the community be at the forefront of driving those solutions, including economic opportunities from businesses down to youth. And education opportunities.
Thank you, Dr. Pugh. Really important points to keep an eye out for how these our funds are going to be implemented equitably. Yeah. I want to go ahead and turn it over to all of you for one question. I want to make sure that you all have a chance to answer this question. It looks like we've got 10 minutes left. So I wanted to go ahead and ask each of you, the IRA includes incentives, including tax credits and rebates, for homeowners who can invest in energy efficient appliances, including solar energy and moving to all electric, installing heat pumps. What does this mean for low income neighborhoods? How can local leaders guide and ensure low income families are not only aware of this opportunity, but can ensure that they benefit from this as well, and so that gap in opportunity is addressed? Dr. Pugh, we can start with you if you'd like.
Actually, one of the things that we were looking at in our community, and now through the IRA, we're seeing that there's even greater opportunity, was faith-based and nonprofit organizations, so that can benefit as well. And so when we've been voluntarily working with faith-based, having community anchors that can exemplify and be examples of what renewable energy and cleaner energy sources can look like, how they can be realized, how it can be job opportunities, how it can be educational opportunities, but getting greater awareness of communities first and foremost, and awareness of the opportunities that will be made available through the IRA for faith-based and nonprofit organizations, and for homeowners who are trusting of these institutions. And so that would be what I would offer first and foremost in this short amount of time.
Thank you, Dr. Pugh. Dr. Hill.
Yeah, I would just echo what Dr. Pugh said. I think, especially in the Minneapolis-St. Paul community, where there was relocation efforts in the federal government for American Indians to go to urban environments, but they were often left flat. So what we see is or under-resourced, I would say. What we see in urban environments, a lot of American Indians who are well below the poverty line and often unhoused. And so I think that's the first challenge, is to be able to develop housing, low-income housing that can meet the needs of our unhoused communities, populations here in our cities. And I think that can in large part be driven, and the resources, are resourced, from our nonprofits. We have a lot of nonprofits that serve the community in a very good way. They're stable and they do it well, so trusting those nonprofits to funnel those funds and develop housing communities, affordable housing communities. And I think secondly, as she had already said, also is with those of us, very few who are able to be homeowners ourselves, is to have some, I think, clear-cut language and opportunities that again could be driven by the local nonprofits, communities and organizations to push that out to us, right? And provide us those resources and opportunities pretty directly. And so in terms of our reservation communities, I think, nonprofits help there too, but also funneling those through their tribal governments, the tribal councils. And I think there's opportunities for that through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Lily.
Yeah, so first I want to say that yesterday, Schools for Climate Action spoke at a press conference with our congressman in our community, and that one of our students spoke in Spanish to help make the information that was being provided about the IRA more accessible to our community. And then also, it is clear in our community that incentives to use clean energy are too often only available to people with significant financial privilege. In our county, for instance, the power company provides incentives for households to use less electricity between 3 and 9 p.m. And for people who work full-time or multiple jobs, attend school, or have long commutes, these hours are not available to do things such as laundry. And I'd like to once again emphasize the importance of providing funds or incentives to school districts to implement clean energy infrastructure in communities. I believe that this is one of the most efficient ways to address inequities in access to climate solutions. Addressing the climate crisis on school campuses can help introduce the school employees, students, and families to simple, cost-efficient ways to implement environmental practices in other areas of their lives. As I mentioned earlier, one of the main areas that I focus on is climate education. I believe it is essential for climate education to be taught in a way that emphasizes systemic solutions to climate change instead of focusing on individual consumers, since consumer options are not accessible to everyone. Finally, I think the best way to ensure that environmental policies are just, equitable, and benefiting as many people as possible is to ensure that diverse voices are always present when creating climate policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Irene.
Yeah, so Black and Latino consumers pay higher utility bills while generally using less. I wanted to start off with some of the data to underscore this point. And we know that Black and Latino communities are also more likely to be located closer to fossil fuel emitting power plants, meaning that investment in clean energy production can reduce harmful health impacts. We need to ensure that there are mechanisms in place for not only homeowners to access these benefits, but renters as well. In Chapter 1 of the Latino Climate Justice Framework, we advocate for some of these solutions. And so some of that looks like we have to broaden access to clean energy and ensure renewable energy standards include programs like community-based energy projects, that they include microgrid projects, demand energy response incentives, which is something Lily just mentioned, and that they're coupled with that community solar programs accessible to renters are coupled with things like battery storage, energy efficiency options, and a comprehensive electric vehicle charging networks. And an example of this is the shared solar program in Los Angeles. I haven't yet seen something that is extremely robust, but I do think that we need to amplify more solutions, and that the IRA money cannot just go toward homeowners. It needs to be accessible towards renters as well. Another thing I wanted to uplift is something that we cover in Chapter 3 of the Latino Climate Justice Framework, and that is around equitable access to public processes and language access. So we need to be able to increase community involvement in decision-making processes. And a lot of that has to do with how the programs are translated, how they're promoted, and who the validators are in the communities. And so I think this was mentioned by a couple of the speakers, but in order for there to be like true equity and accessibility, it's not enough just to have the information available for people who already are engaged in this, but we need to have, for example, promotora models where people go house to house in certain neighborhoods and are able to talk about the incentives in real, tangible ways, and what this means for their home, for their landlord, and how that's connected to their energy bill. And so those are things that I think there are programs out there. We just need to be able to connect the dots and expand the programming that is working to utilities across the country.
Irene, thank you. And thank you to each of you for joining us today and for this rich discussion. We are going to wrap this up. Thank you all. It is now my pleasure to introduce a special recorded conversation between Dr. Salas and the former first White House National Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy. Thank you all.
My name is Renee Salas, and I'm the senior author of the 2022 Lancet Countdown U.S. brief, having been the lead author for the past 4 years and a global author.
And I'm Gina McCarthy. I am the former National Climate Advisor for the Biden administration, and I'm the former EPA administrator under the Obama administration. And I am a big fangirl of Renee Salas. So that's who we are.
Well, thank you. It's such an honor and privilege to have you here, especially in the middle of you getting some much deserved rest. So your leadership as the National Climate Advisor led to the most aggressive action on climate change in U.S. history, creating new jobs and unprecedented clean energy innovation and investments. What are you most proud of during your time in the Biden administration?
Oh, Lord, that's a really good question. I'm proud of the fact that I joined it, and I'm proud of the fact that we had a really terrific climate policy office that was working across the administration, because it really changed the flavor of the discussion of climate tremendously. It was no longer just an isolated issue, but it was understood as something that needed to underpin and be considered in every decision across the administration, not just as its own little island. And so for me, you know, creating a policy office within the White House with that broad reach was enormously important, because it made people understand that climate change is not just real, but it impacts everything we do. And therefore, we need to consider it in every single decision that we made. So that was really, for me, one of the big changes that I most enjoyed. But Renee, if I can just go on a little bit more, it also, because this is something that you and I have talked about now, I guess, for years, is that it allowed us a lot more latitude during the Biden administration with the framing that President Biden had on climate that he articulated even during his campaign was that climate change doesn't have to create responses that require sacrifice for us to resolve. And in fact, climate change was the most challenging problem that the world faced, that we're creating basically instability and security challenges, in economic devastation, and impacts on the most vulnerable communities. And instead, we could actually look at a very positive response and opportunity-driven way of addressing climate that would engage people, that wouldn't ask them to sacrifice, but would give them benefits. And you and I for years have been talking about the fact that health is a driver for people that matter. So it's the economy, it's keeping people safe, it's allowing them to understand that climate change can benefit them as human beings in their condition, and that health is a significant reason why climate needs to be addressed and can be addressed in ways that people will engage in instead of run away from. So for me, that whole framing was why I went to the Biden administration, and I'm no longer there, but you know, that drive for continued change and that drive to make sure that health is part of the equation continues to be, you know, part of my life and will be for as long as I have it.
Well, that is great news to all of us that you will continue to stay engaged, because we definitely need you, and we have been inspired by everything that you've done. So thank you for your service. And your words from years ago continue to resonate. This isn't about polar bears and icebergs. It's about our health, our children. So the 2022 U.S. brief really tries to hopefully further encapsulate that. And I think also to harness the unique opportunity that we have right now, because with the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the CHIPS Act, you know, the federal government is doing a lot on climate change, but we can't have it be a great we're done, because we know that there's still so much left to do. So what else should the federal government be doing, and how can we keep momentum up for climate action?
Well, Renee, I hope that you and all the authors of at least the U.S. Lancet report take a little credit for the way it's been maturing. You know, I did read the material that you sent to me. I very much appreciated it. And it has very crisp sort of ways of outlining what we can do, but also how we can do that in a way that maximizes health benefits, particularly for, you know, the communities that are most impacted and have been for a long time by these environmental challenges that we're facing. And so I think the thing that I liked the best was, I think you took more leaps forward. I think it's very clear about the 5 priorities that you're looking at, the sectors that where the opportunities arise and where the benefits will be significant for families and for communities. But it also challenged, you know, it issued policy, you know, recommendations that are both, I think, some of which we were able to embrace and some of which still hang out there that we need to think about in terms of how you make a transition from fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy economy. And so for me, we looked at the sectors in the US when I was in the administration, and I'm sure they continue to do that now because there's much more work that obviously that needs to be done. And we look for ways that we could spark that transition in sectors like transportation, in sectors like the energy sector, even in sectors like agriculture and others, where we know climate impacts everything. The idea was, how do we start making investments in those sectors that actually generate momentum that people can see and feel and taste in their own lives, where we put people back to work, we pay good salaries for those people, where we start manufacturing in the US again, because we lost that decades ago in the Midwest and it's never recovered, where we can work with agriculture and farmers to start doing better at how they produce food for us that's not just healthy, but that is healthy for our climate quest as well, because it's all of this is essential. And so I really appreciate the way it's framed, because I think it allows people to embrace the challenges in each of these sectors. Plus, it's underpinned with an understanding, as we all in this business know, that we're just getting started. You know, we are going to be able to achieve between the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law some major benefits, I think, in movement forward. We know that between those two, we've got covered our ability to get, you know, half of our greenhouse gas emissions reduced by 2030. But as you indicated, the challenge is global. How do you translate this kind of thing to the work that's going to be undertaken soon with the Conference of the Parties in Egypt, where I will thankfully be, which is great. I have opportunities to go. How do you translate this? How do you make this a really well thought out strategy that can produce the kind of greenhouse gas reductions worldwide and get people on a better course in all countries, not just in the US? And so I think it's very challenging. I think you nailed it in terms of some of the major sectors where we've improved, but you've also nailed it by saying, hey, it ain't enough. We have to keep pushing.
Greetings all. I'm Jeremy Hess. I'm an emergency physician, professor, and director of the Center for Health and the Global Environment at the University of Washington. I'm also an author on the Global Report and have had the privilege of serving as the senior author on the U.S. brief since 2018. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. John Balbus, a longtime colleague and friend. Dr. Balbus will be delivering our closing keynote. He's the acting director of the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity at the Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Balbus is a physician, a scientist, and a member of the National Academy of Medicine. He served as the senior advisor for public health at the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences and as chief health scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund. He's been a long champion for climate action and health equity, and I'm looking forward to his perspective. Dr. Balbus, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of the event today for inviting me to speak here today, and especially to the whole team that produced the Lancet Countdown and the U.S. Policy Brief for your incredibly important work, combining numbers and narrative, as you've done so well in this event, to describe the intricate relationships between climate change and public health. I'm honored to represent the Department of Health and Human Services today and want to be sure to convey the regrets of Secretary Becerra and Assistant Secretary for Health, Admiral Rachel Levine, who would be here if they could have been. The report you're launching today is critically important and profoundly underscores the urgency of our the climate change response in public health and healthcare. And as the COVID pandemic has laid bare, climate change isn't happening in a vacuum. The ways in which it threatens our health interact with existing inequities to place the heaviest burden on those already suffering from degraded environments and health disparities. And we've seen this summer this all play out in real life. I'm sure for most of you, Hurricane Ian, third deadliest hurricane with incredibly rapid strengthening over the Gulf as climate change is leading to with our Gulf hurricanes. 16 hospitals taken out of commission, 1,000 people having to be evacuated. And that's just one of the climate-related weather extremes we've seen, the heat waves in California, the flooding in Kentucky, the devastating wildfire and smoke in the western United States. So this is real, it's happening now, and we have action that has to happen now. Our mission at the Department of Health and Human Services to enhance the health and well-being of all Americans cannot be met without addressing climate change. We're working hard to achieve our vision where everyone, especially those most vulnerable, is protected from the health impacts of climate change. And for us, it also means a health sector that is prepared to operate in the midst of increased climate-related health threats, and also that has drastically reduced its own greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Biden administration's economy-wide goals of 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. We understand this vision will require resources, and that this is extremely difficult for a sector that is already struggling to respond to the pandemic. And we've heard this straight from the health systems and suppliers who've responded to the 6 climate-related requests for information that HHS has published this year. But in order to protect not only future generations, but all of us relying on healthcare in the United States right now, the sector needs to adapt. This has been driven home time and again. as extreme weather events have stressed hospitals already struggling to cope with the COVID pandemic. And in addition, healthcare contributes about 8.5% to overall U.S. carbon emissions. So the fundamental motto in medicine, above all, do no harm, means not only preparing for the effects of climate change on health, but also that we must stop contributing to the problem. And we've made some good progress this year on this front. To start, we joined the COP26 health program, committed to building climate resilience in our health systems and decarbonizing our health systems. Our office has been working very closely with federal health systems like the Veterans Health Administration, the Defense Health Agency, the Indian Health Service, and others to meet these goals and to help to implement Executive Order 14057, which calls for the federal government to meet all of the greenhouse gas reduction goals. And through the White House and HHS Health Sector Climate Pledge, we've also invited private sector leaders to join federal health systems on this journey. And we're continuing to roll out new supports and information on accessing federal assistance to help these private sector partners. As an office at the federal level, though, we recognize that most of the action on climate resilience has to happen at the state and especially the local level. And so we've been working very closely with our regional offices to hold climate change and health equity summits, to raise and listen to the voices of communities in the regions that are being hardest hit by climate change impacts, and to enhance the coordination of federal resources to address these local needs. HHS has been working directly with states and cities for years through the CDC's Climate Ready Cities and States initiative, and more recently through Medicaid agreements like a recent agreement with the state of Oregon that allows states to introduce innovative actions to address climate threats to their population with Medicaid funding. Of course, the LIHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, has expanded greatly with congressional support in the last year to implement cooling programs across the country too. And our office, the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity, is playing a unique and important role within the federal government, using our convening powers and technical assistance to support all of HHS in developing a robust climate adaptation and resilience plan and bringing together the suite of federal resources across the agencies available to support the public health and healthcare delivery systems in addressing the climate crisis. For example, this year we've launched the Climate and Health Outlook. I hope everybody has had a chance to see this. It's a novel product that not only includes a seasonal forecast for health, interpreting the 30 and 90-day forecast for temperature, precipitation, and the government's forecast for drought, hurricanes, and wildfires from a health standpoint, but it also identifies and puts numbers to the people most vulnerable to these impacts in the areas that are being affected, and catalogs the various federal resources that are available to help these people stay safe. We're also in the midst of a webinar series describing federal resources available to the health sector to achieve decarbonization and enhance climate resilience, and we'll be working across HHS and other federal agencies to develop and disseminate revised guidance on health sector resilience and decarbonization. And we're planning additional outreach and events to help raise awareness and build capacity for action across the healthcare and public health sectors. This will, of course, include ongoing resources related to the Inflation Reduction Act. While the Inflation Reduction Act has no funding for climate change going to the Department of Health and Human Services, there are tax credits, technical assistance and tools, and it's creating remarkable opportunities for health stakeholders to become more energy efficient and well prepared. And our office is helping to raise the word on this and make the health sector aware of these resources. So I hope you'll agree we're making great progress, and yet the urgency of the situation means we still have much more to do to place health at the center of conversations about climate change, as Administrator McCarthy, as Marina in the beginning so articulately laid out. As we go to the COP, health, there's no health day at the COP. Health still needs to be elevated as not just something that people talk about, but something that the mainstream climate committee acts on and helps the health sector to at the same way that it's helping other sectors. And also to mobilize the resources and the will to assure that communities are protected and the health sector is adequately supported in its necessary efforts to adapt to the growing challenges posed by climate change. So let me close there. Again, express my appreciation for your important work and our offices, and in fact, all of the Department of Health and Human Services readiness to continue to collaborate with you. Thank you all for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Balbus, and thank you to all of the amazing speakers today for sharing your wisdom and insights. Thanks to those of you who are joining us live and those watching after the fact. We hope that this launch is just the beginning. We want this suite of materials to be a living tool that furthers the work you're already doing and allows us to more powerfully achieve our collective vision together. If you visit our website, lancetcountdownus.org, we have a suite of materials we'd like to direct you to. This includes online and PDF versions of the brief, which include 2 amazing infographics created by the working group, an appendix with case studies and critical insights written by phenomenal members of our working group, available in PDF and online soon. We also have a standalone executive summary, new science highlighting the 2022 U.S. indicators, a summary for the general public and another specifically for medical professionals, and summaries that focus in on 4 U.S. regions. These are all available in both English and Spanish. And we really hope that these will arm you with a way to engage key audiences with the material and keep the message coming.
Thank you, Naomi. The Global Report also has a suite of material, including indicator reports from sites like Europe, China, and Australia, and country briefs from around the world, videos and social media shareables, and a data explorer for the indicators. This product exists because of a dedicated and passionate working group from over 80 different organizations across the U.S. connected to this global effort. There are far too many to name, but you will see their names here to showcase the amazing village that made this happen. From global authors to reviewers to designers and editors, as you see here. One individual we would like to call out specifically is Dr. Juan Aguilera from Stanford, who generously donated his time translating the appendix and additional materials into Spanish. Thank you, Dr. Aguilera, from all of us. From infographic authors to appendix case studies and critical insight authors, as you see here, we are deeply grateful for your contributions. And to the focus on regional authors, as you see here, we thank you for your time and expertise. And thank you to everyone who participated. Your dedication and passion continue to inspire this process and make it what it is today.
In addition, we'd like to issue a special thank you to the institutions who are financial sponsors and who helped make this work possible. They're outlined on this slide. Our gold level sponsors include the Climate and Health Institute of George Washington University, the University of Arizona Mellon Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health, the University of Oregon Environmental Initiative, and the Center for Health and the Global Environment at the University of Washington. Our civil level sponsors include Emory University, the University of Colorado Climate and Health Program, the Christina Lee Brown Envirome Institute at the University of Louisville, the University of California, Merced, University of Wisconsin Center for Sustainability in the Global Environment, the Nelson Institute, and the Yale School of Public Health. And our bronze level sponsors include the Boston College Global Public Health Program and the Common Good, the University of Nebraska Medical Center, College of Public Health, and lastly, the University of Oregon Center for Science Communication Research. Thank you to all. We don't receive funding to do this work, and we rely on generous donations from our academic partners to make it happen. Thank you. In addition, it takes a village. There are so many institutions who have contributed in ways we can't even begin to quantify, including all of those shown here, including the primary supporting institutions and our core author team and brand sponsors for this work. A hearty and deep thanks.
And a thank you to the Global Lancet Countdown team, especially Dr. Marina Romanello, Dr. Francis McGuire, and Maria Wallawender for the continued opportunity to co-create these products together. It's an honor to have this partnership and to do this with you. Thank you to the American Public Health Association for your continued partnership, especially to Dr. Georges Benjamin and Catherine Catalano. It is an honor. Thank you to Paige Knappenberger Lester and your colleagues at Climate Nexus for your continued vital partnership that makes this process what it is. As always, Paige, your contributions as an author to communication strategy and your leadership in planning this phenomenal event were unparalleled. And thank you to the host institution, the Harvard Global Health Institute, and the faculty director, Dr. Louise Ivers, and the leadership team. And notably, a huge thank you to the phenomenal work of the lead U.S. coordinator at HCHI, Luke Testa. This process would not have happened without you, seriously. And a special shout out to Kelly Poyapon for lending your previous experience and filling critical needs. And I'm humbled to stand here virtually by these three powerhouses, Dr. DeJarnette and Baylor, and you stepped into the co-lead role masterfully. So thank you. And Dr. Hess, it's been one of the greatest honors of my career to work alongside you. So thank you. And this is just the beginning. In my experience in the emergency department, when a patient is crashing, the room fills with those committed to saving the life of the patient. Everyone has a unique skill set and role, and the patient is only saved by everyone doing their part and working together. Now, this room is filling at an accelerated pace, especially as we care for the patients and communities most affected by climate change. So let's go. There's so much work to do. So let's do it together. Thank you.